to provide basic goods and services, plan for the future, and escape a cycle of recurring crisis. We're carrying out the campaign on municipal fiscal health at the Lincoln Institute by mobilizing new research and developing tools and educational programs to enable and promote fiscal health domestically and internationally. While the causes of fiscal stress are complex, we have identified 6 pillars of municipal fiscal health that provide a framework for advancing solutions across multiple levels of government. One of the 6 pillars we identified is infrastructure funding, and to that end, this installment in our webinar series will introduce you to the use of public-private partnerships, also known as P3s, specifically the unique model for this instrument developed by the National Development Council, which stands as an important model of how P3s, when well designed, can offer efficient solutions for enhancing the provision of public services and infrastructure. To let you know how the webinar today will be formatted, we're going to begin with a presentation by our expert presenters, which will be followed by a brief question and answer segment, after which we'll show you some resources that you can consult if you want to learn more about this topic. All of the attendees, due to the large size of attendees on this webinar, will be on mute, but we encourage you to use the chat function if you want to submit a question that we will see and share with presenters, either during the webinar and after, to make sure that they're aware of your comments and questions as listeners. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first expert presenter today, Jane Campbell, who serves as Director of the Washington Office of the National Development Council. Jane, I'd love for you to say a few words about your background to the audience, and in the meantime, I'll begin introducing your background. Jane heads the National Development Council's Office of Public Policy and Advocacy, where she manages NDC's public policy efforts in Washington. In 2001, she serves as the first woman mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, where she attracted nearly $3 billion of investment capital to redevelopment projects around the city. Recently, she served as a staff director for the United States Senate Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee and has spent her entire career advocating for economic development programs. Jane, I'd love for you to say a few words about your background to the audience, and then we'll introduce our second presenter.
Thank you so very much, Lourdes. It's delightful to be with the audience and to share an idea and a concept that is been developed by the National Development Council, which is a nonprofit organization that's been working with communities to try to get capital into underserved areas for nearly 50 years. So combining my work as a public official and now my work as an advocate with a non-governmental organization is a great partnership, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Great. Thank you, Jane. I now want to introduce our second expert presenter, Mike Bailey, who serves as Director of Technology and Information Services for the City of Redmond. As background, Mike has worked in local government since 1980. He was the City of Redmond Finance Director from 2008 to 2017. He's a former president of the Washington Finance Officers Association and served on the Government Finance Officers Association's Executive Board, where he was chair of the Budget and Management Committee, and also served as local government representative to the Streamlined Sales Tax Project. He's a CPA, and his BA and MBA are from the University of Puget Sound. His expertise includes conducting workshops on local government financial management, budget matters, and financial leadership. Work that he does around strategic planning for governments is also part of his well of expertise. Mike, thank you for joining us. I'd love for you to say a few words about your background to the audience.
Sure, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be able to participate in this webinar as well. We certainly have benefited from some of the things we will be talking about over the course of the next hour, and be glad to share our experience in why we did that and how it helped us achieve those goals.
Great. Terrific. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the presentation to our experts so they can walk our audience through the model, and then we'll talk about some examples and take some questions. Jane, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's go to the first slide after the title. If you look at public-private partnerships can be considered on a continuum. You know, on one end you have just the straight public development in all the traditional manners. And then you've got our model, which is a P3 for social infrastructure, which is primarily what we've used it for, although it could be used for other kinds of infrastructure as well. There's the privatization of public assets, subsidizing private development, and straight up private development. So often when people talk generically about public-private partnerships, they may talk about a public subsidy to encourage a private development to move forward, or they may be talking about privatizing public assets, or as in today's conversation, we're talking about a very specific model, which if you look to the next slide, you'll see there are two most common public-private partnership structures if you have a structured P3. The one that we're going to talk about today, which is ours, the National Development Council's American model, and the international model. The American model relies on a combination of the lowest cost of capital, which is municipal debt that is tax exempt, either through 6320 bonds or 501c3 bonds. And the international model is a combination of equity and taxable debt. And so in each model, you get the efficiency and the expertise of the private sector. But in the American model, you still have the opportunity to have the lowest cost of capital, which is described on the next slide, where you can see the comparison between the two. The ownership in the American model is through a not-for-profit special purpose entity. And in the international model, it's either public ownership or private control. The uniqueness about NDC is that we have a group exemption from the federal IRS that allows us to create special purpose not-for-profit entities to build and maintain a facility on behalf of a local community very quickly. And they can quickly get their 501c3 status using our group exemption. The financing in the American model is 100% tax-exempt debt. The development is private, build-to-suit, integrated development with incentives to perform. The operations can be private and cost-based, subject to performance. And the maintenance can be privately contracted with a dedicated repair and replacement reserve. And we can incorporate whatever kind of special concerns there are in a local community. For example, communities may be concerned about the inclusion of women and minority businesses or local residents. All of that can be structured into the agreement. The occupancy costs under the NDC American model are the lowest in the industry, and the facilities usually continue to be exempt from property tax. As compared to the international model, which has an equity and taxable debt financing model, which is a higher cost of capital. Because when you're using private equity, understandably, the private equity investor needs to have a higher rate of return than the purchaser of a municipal bond. The development is the same. It can use private sector debt. And the maintenance, as you can see, is similar. The occupancy costs on the international model are higher, and often those facilities are subject to property tax. So moving to the next model, you can see here is a more detailed comparison between the two different kinds of financing. Taxable is a combination of taxable debt and equity with a required debt coverage ratio of 1.1 or higher, and there often are two lenders, the construction lender and then the permanent lender, and there may be difficulty with an abatement. In the tax-exempt, it's 100% tax-exempt debt, so the private money comes from purchasers of the municipal bonds. The debt coverage is 1 to 0. There's a single loan, and the properties are more accepting of abatement. So you look now at the pillars, next slide, the pillars of value: development expertise, financing, dedicated revenue stream, and the opportunity to look at the operation. So each of these are uniquely available under the American model. If you move to the next slide, you can see that's highlighted what is really the unique situation about the American model is the financing and the revenue stream. So turn to the next slide, and you'll see during the design phase, you can see this chart where the special purpose entity sits in the middle. The public agency, who are the people who want the facility developed, work with the developer, the architect engineer, and the general contractor and construction manager with whatever subcontractors are necessary. The development team is at risk, but the public agency stays fully connected to the collaborative process. As you move into the next slide and the next phase, which is the delivery phase, the public agency enters into a lease with the special purpose entity, who is the owner of the facility. And the special purpose entity, in turn, has a contractual relationship with the developer, the architect and engineer, the general contractor. So the development team is at risk, but the public agency stays connected to the fully collaborative process. We go to the next slide, you can see how that happens. During the delivery phase, the public agency, through its lease with the special purpose not-for-profit, is also able to have representatives on the board of the special purpose not-for-profit. Not a majority, because this is a private entity, but they are able to have representatives. The special purpose not-for-profit entity then contracts with a private property manager on a 3 to 5 year contract with a performance-based renewal, including capital repairs being funded into a repair and replacement reserve. So what you have in that manner is you structure in a regular opportunity for the special purpose not-for-profit entity to require that the operation and maintenance are at the highest level for the most effective cost. Compare that in the next slide. You can see the international model where the public agency simply contracts with the design build team manager, and they contract with the general contractor and the subcontractor. So the equity investor is at risk in the same way, and the involvement of the public agency can vary under the international model. We turn to delivery phase, which is on the next slide in the international model. You'll see that the public agency has a concession or a franchise agreement with the design build team. The equity investor is at risk in terms of their contractual relationship, and the facility manager, the general contractor, are all contracted with the design build team. And you can, under this model, the involvement of the public agency varies. Look at it on the next phase, the operations phase. The public agency will enter into a 35 to 50 year concession or franchise agreement. That is a very long-term agreement with the owner and design builder, who has a contractual relationship with the private property manager, which may or may not be a related entity. the property management is handled by that long-term agreement, capital repairs are funded by annual payments to the property manager that are sized to cover the cost of repairs, with excess being retained by the property management firm. So that is a fairly quick description of the two models. So the question then becomes, when would you use the NDC American Model? When the public agency views the activity as an essential governmental responsibility, when operating costs are critical, and when specialized development skills are necessary. And it would be one thing for me to describe this, but it would be more effective, we thought, for this conversation to have an actual client tell the story, which is why we're so honored to have Mike Bailey with us. And so he is going to tell us the story of Redmond City Hall. Clearly, the City of Redmond thought that City Hall was an essential government activity. And even though Mike was not the finance director when the decision was made, he did research on what had gone on. So Mike, will you tell us the story of Redmond City Hall and how you came to the decision to use the American model?
Sure, Jane, I'd be glad to. I'm, again, glad to participate in this webinar. And Jane, be sure and just, if I'm missing a point that you think might be helpful to the audience, feel free to jump in and coach me to that point. I'd be glad to make sure we don't miss anything. You can see in the current slide a couple of different renditions of what was contemplated when Redmond was considering constructing a new city hall, now about 15 years ago or so. And the first two of those renditions are a little bit off the mark. The bottom one, I think, is still an architect's rendition. Although it looks like an actual picture, and maybe it is, because that is exactly what we ended up with as a result of this process. I think on the next slide we'll talk a little bit about why we went down this path and what the venture was. We, like many local governments, over time grew, and as a result had to lease space and had core city staff in different locations around the city, and that was a pretty inefficient way to try and manage the responsibilities that we have. It also was becoming more and more expensive. Fortunately, we have a vibrant and growing city, so this lease space was not inexpensive, and in fact there were much better private uses that could be that this space could be put to use for. So certainly we wanted to consolidate staff, but we also wanted to free up this space as we continued to grow economically and see more private participation in the economy here. As we were thinking about that, you know, you have the conundrum, how much space do you build for growth? And so we'll look at some numbers, I think, here in a little bit that talks about how we decided to approach that issue. And again, here's where the city, prior to my arriving, did an excellent job of thinking about the future. And we, in fact, even still today, have room for growth, and we've managed that space so that it didn't just become more room for the people that were already here in a way that's really facilitated our ability to manage where people are located and the growth as well. Lastly, how do you go about doing this? There's a variety of ways. One thing that I think I'll take just a second to talk about here is sort of the traditional local government model in the U.S. is a design, bid, build with municipal debt sort of model, and where a lot of the risk is directly back on the local government, and in the form of having a scope initially of a project that you work to design to, that then turns into bid documents, where you want to continue to contain and manage the scope, but managing that scope becomes a risk factor, where the independent functions of design and then bid and build with a general contractor who will have subs can sometimes have some gaps and potentially some overlaps that represent surprises later on in the project. And so I think one of the concerns that the City Council had here was to make sure to manage that risk in a very proactive sort of way. They also wanted a city hall that reflected the 21st century type city that Redmond, the home of Microsoft and now several space agency companies and other 21st century type companies. We wanted to reflect that in kind of who we were as a city government as well. So those were some of the things that went into thinking about what we wanted to accomplish with addressing some of these concerns and building a new city hall here at Redmond. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics here. We ended up with a 4-story, 100,000 square foot, very nice Class A type office space city hall. Along with that, in a growing city, parking is always a challenge and continues to be a challenge today. But with respect to city employees, we addressed that challenge with a parking garage. So the project consisted of both the building and the parking garage and the site improvements that were necessary to accommodate both, as well as demolishing the building that ended up we built right alongside, right next to the old City Hall. So the demolishing of the old City Hall and the old separate building called the Tech Center were part of the project as well. You'll see, I think later on we'll be able to show an illustration of the layout. There were site improvements that make the City Hall campus really a nice community amenity that goes beyond just housing the staff that provide the service to the community. As you can see, again, we left room for growth. We had 260 staff at move-in. I think we're slightly above that now, having weathered the recession and then begun to restore some lost positions during the recession. We are well below the 350 full occupancy. So I think that 20-plus year vision really held up very well. And again, to the extent that the city planners at the time that scoped the size of the project used a lot of very good foresight. So that's really served us well as well. Let's take a look on the next slide of kind of how we structured this, because I think it's very consistent with what Jane was describing earlier. The City of Redmond is the the sponsoring, I guess, agency. We are the tenant owner on the orange box in the upper left, and again, our council was very interested in a project approach that would leverage both our capital and the private sector involvement to the best combination. And I think, again, that's exactly what we got. The special purpose entity, Redmond Community Properties, actually owned the project and the building. And then through contractual arrangements between the parties, the City of Redmond and then the actual developer, builder and property manager, Ray Runstead, this collaborative relationship was formed, and Jane used that word, and I think it's a perfect one. That was our experience, is that was a very collaborative relationship. Both NDC and then the Redmond Community Properties, that sprung from that, as well as the Wright Runstead organization as the private developer, were very interested in making sure that this was a win-win for all the parties, and remain so today. And I'll come back to that because I think that's a pretty significant point. The city was very involved in the scoping of the actual project itself, the way that the scoping translated into design and into construction, so the city did not feel that it was giving up anything in using this approach by way of helping to manage the project to successfully achieve the goals we had. It was, again, very collaborative. We felt like we were very much full partners at the table, and at the end of the day, everybody was very interested in making sure that we ended up with a successful outcome. So the next slide will talk a little bit about how we...
Everybody knows that blue, the Redmond Community Partners, when I talk about a special purpose entity, that's each one of them has a name, and so that's what that is. Go on, tell us about the design.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. So there were, again, some goals we had with respect to the project, and certainly wanted to make sure it was address sustainability values that are very strong in our community, and again, around the way the space was going to be used, both by the staff and by the community, because a key element of the design concept was making it a community space as well as a space that enabled city staff to do their work. That facilitated, efficient use of the space for the city staff, the good business practice in terms of the way that enabled us to do a good job of meeting community needs. And then lastly, the transition from where staff were before, either in the old city hall or in some of that lease space, and how we activated the building with the move-in and things of that nature. So those are some of the things that we were interested in making sure that we accomplished when we set out to build a new city hall. I think the next slide is probably a diagram of the campus, and you can see the city hall's in the lower left-hand corner. We are fortunate enough to be right along a river. There's a trail that very long regional trail that runs alongside that river. Old City Hall was just above that, so you can see that open green space. That's where the former City Hall was, and you can see just above that is the Senior Center, which remains today. So the parking garage, which is to the right of the Senior Center, not only facilitates the City Hall staff, but also has room for participants at the Senior Center for their programming, and as well as City Hall and city vehicles. So that four-story parking garage facilitated that need very, very well. The public safety building between City Hall and the parking garage pre-existed, and we just went through a renovation, so it's ready for the next 20 years. And but you can see a lot of green space, and parking is in the lower center of the space, and to the right of that is the regional library. And the little bitty building just above the library is a local district court. So you can see it's a community kind of space, a wide variety of various uses, and certainly enough space in City Hall to enable us to consolidate that city staff and meet community needs. So again, I think the council, who were very involved in decision making around the approach we took, ended up very pleased with the outcome, and I would say that there's some community pride with respect to our City Hall campus and the way that this particular project facilitated creating this kind of space. It's now been well in excess of 10 years, and I just hosted some out-of-town guests here for a meeting just this week, and again, they remarked at the new City Hall and are always quite surprised to hear that it's been over 10 years now, but yeah, it was a very much sort of future-proof, if you will, concept and design that's served our community very, very well. On the next slide, drill down into the City Hall site itself just a little bit, and you can see that again, this notion of a great lawn, some of the connecting walkways and plazas and things of that sort. Now that the weather has begun to improve in the Pacific Northwest, and it's been a long time coming, these spaces are very much activated with both events, but even without events, lots of people take great advantage of these spaces. And you can see to the left, again, that blue is indeed the river that runs alongside here, and a lot of use of the existing river trail. So again, turned into both a great combination of space for the staff to do their work, but also the community to take advantage of and enjoy. On the next slide, we take I think a quick look at the parking garage. As I said, it's a four-story, again, a modern exterior look and feel to it as well. It accommodates both participants of the Senior Center or visitors to the public safety building, as well as city vehicles and then city employees' private vehicles. So again, that's worked out very, very well. Was originally part of the project as a whole, and So therefore, it was part of the development agreements and constructed by and supported by Wright Renstead as well. So we'll take a quick look at the timeline on the next slide, and you can see that we found our partners through an RFP process back in 2003, and then use that approach to make some selections around who we were going to partner with in terms of a development team, and then that team selected an architect, and we began to work through the legal documents to make sure that our understanding of these partnership and collaborative relationships was appropriately characterized from a legal perspective as well. The lease that Jane mentioned earlier that the sponsor participates in was agreed to in February of 2004, and then using that American Model mechanism, financing was provided for. The city commits to a long-term general debt type lease through these relationships, and that enables us to get the project underway. So I would say that from the selection of the architect, which is kind of when you really begin to activate the team, to working through the legal relationships and documenting those in the lease and then conducting the financing, we were able to move in to City Hall just a few short years after that. On the next slide, tell you about the money. In terms of the money, the city, leased the property to the special purpose entity that Jane has described, with a lease back arrangement for the completed project. We were looking at a project price of about $39 million, and committed to by through lease payments by the city to the special purpose entity, which was then used to finance the design and construction of the project. The bonds that were sold by Redmond Community Properties, again the special purpose entity, were in our case were the 6320, which is an IRS ruling, is what it refers to, type financing, and so that enabled us to use to back the financing through a commitment of ongoing lease payments for 30 years, as I recall, in the initial financing, that would provide the resources to pay back all the investors. And so that's essentially how it was structured. From the city's perspective, it was a commitment to a long-term lease, and which we considered a full faith and credit general obligation of the city to our partners in this project. The lease payments that we ended up making to Redmond Community Properties, the last bullet point, not only provided for the debt service that was incurred by Redmond Community Properties, but also for the ongoing maintenance of the building, which was continues to be provided for today by Wright Renstead, and as well as the reserves that Jane mentioned were part of the concept, so that we could make the kinds of investments that kept the building in great condition during the term, at least during the term of the financing, so that we ended up with a building that was, throughout the duration was meeting our needs. In terms of the 63.
Yeah, tell a little bit about what a 6320 bond is, just because we use that term really easily, and Mike explained that it's an IRS ruling. What it allows is it allows a not-for-profit corporation to issue debt to finance a facility for tax-exempt purposes if a local government entity endorses the financing. In this instance, it was the City of Redmond. The facility will be operated by a governmental or tax-exempt entity, again, City of Redmond, and the facility reverts to the ownership of the endorsing local government at the retirement of the debt. That's a very important when you hear the rest of the story. So here you are in your new building, Mike. Move to the next slide. Tell us life in the new building. Did it work?
Yeah, actually, as I think I alluded to a couple of times, if you ask almost anybody, which is very rare, today, their opinion of how this turned out, I think unanimous thumbs up, very successful perspective about the goals that we had for this approach and how they turned out. Very, very happy with the way that this all turned out. As I said, the building continues to be managed by the private development partner that we identified through the RFP, Wright Runstead. And I think that's, I'll allude to that here again in just a second, but let me just tell you that we actually have had choices to make changes in who those partners were as we moved along. And because it has worked out so well, we've kept all the original partners in place. And so that's, I think, a testament to how well it is working and how collaborative it did turn out to be. Some of the issues, some of the environment has changed a lot over the time. Security was certainly always an issue, but not like it has become more recently. And so some of the enhancements that we've made over the last couple of years have been with respect to the way that the community can access certain parts of the building and things of that nature. So we've continued to make some investments, again, in cooperation with other parties that are involved in this transaction. I've talked a little bit about the parking, and I think that that's continued to work out very well. Parking, as I said, is a challenging issue in a growing urban core, and so we have given up a little of that green space that you saw in that one diagram to some community parking, but for the most part, the parking concept has worked out well. We're currently renovating the reception space, so one of the changes we're making now, 15 years later, is the concept of kind of an open living room kind of space where people could come and again enjoy this community asset. But we're going to convert some of that into kind of a one-stop shopping reception space where we can bring services down from the upper floors down into that reception space and at the same time provide more conference space for people to be able to interact with city staff right there off the reception area. We're going to actually take some of what was originally intended to be a cafe, which there are several other cafes like in the immediate adjoining area, so we certainly didn't want to compete with them, and we're going to convert some of that cafe lunchroom into some of that conference space. The employees have enjoyed a relatively modest fitness center, and that continues to be very popular and gets lots of use. And one of the complaints I hear from my peers around the state and country is there's inadequate storage, and again, as part of the planning for growth, we certainly have had plenty of room for those kinds of sort of less attractive, I guess, amenities that are certainly important in the building as well. And I think moving on, I think documents and records management is certainly part of the storage issue. But since then, some of the things in our public sector environment have changed a little bit. For instance, while we did inform the lease amounts with some insight as to what the costs of financing were going to be, the costs of financing have gone down over time. So we wanted to look and see if there was an opportunity to refinance that 6320 lease arrangement with more traditional long-term general obligation debt, LTGO, long-term general obligation debt of the city, and see if if that, even though we agreed to this relationship through the 6320 type of structure, did that preclude us at all from modifying that structure and going with a more traditional LTGO type debt structure? And the answer was no. I mean, so we were able to refinance the lease obligations and unwind the contractual relationships in 2013 and sold again traditional LTGO bonds, 20-year bonds, and and those bonds achieved a debt service savings that met our policy standards for debt service savings with a net present value of 1.6 million. And so part of unwinding the original structure, sort of eliminated the need for those relationships. So ownership of the project was transferred then by NDC from the Redmond Community Properties back to the City of Redmond. We resumed ownership of the property and the building and all the amenities that were created through this project, and now we're full owners. And the Redmond Community Properties no longer needs to exist, and NDC was very, very helpful and cooperative in getting us into the new environment. As I said before, and hinted I would come back to it, we then had opportunities to go back and contract now with whomever we wanted to do maintenance and upkeep and some of the improvements in the building that I've talked about. And because it worked so well before, we've retained Wright Runstead to provide that ongoing role in our building here, and are very pleased with the way that's gone. So that's a big sort of change, and I think really a great way to illustrate that model that we used that met all the goals we had at the time did not preclude us from having flexibility in the future to take advantage of savings and to change the model, replace it with a more traditional approach that worked, again, I think in all the parties' best interests. So Jane, hopefully that helps describe a little bit about our experience, and maybe you might want to kind of talk about the bigger picture and how that might compare.
Well, thanks, Mike. I think you've done a great job of describing, and the interesting thing about the Redmond model is that when we say, the reason NDC does it is because we want to lessen the burdens of government. And so we do that in partnership to get the best product for the best price. And we always say, at any point that the financing and the mechanisms are such that it makes sense for the government to buy it back, we're happy to sell it back for the, payment of the bonds and a consideration of $1. And you did exactly the whole cycle of that, which is why we wanted you to be the one to share the story. And it comes back to, why do you use the American model? When the public agency views the activity as critical, when the operating costs are vital to maintain, to be carefully maintained, and when you need the specialized development skills of the private sector. So then one might ask, well, when would you use the international model, the more traditional private equity model? That would be a time when the public agency doesn't necessarily need to maintain a role so strongly in the activity that's being financed, or when the cost of financing is not the critical concern. It's more important to get the project done immediately, timely, to move things forward, or when the activity does not qualify for exempt debt, or when the activity can be funded with qualified private activity bonds. So turn to the next model, next page, excuse me. And this, Mike, I want you to pipe in as you see, because I'm going to try to describe what are the best practices for a local government that's trying to deal with public procurement, trying to analyze, should we get into a P3, why, how, what kind of P3, that the public agency has to have a deliberative process in which they decide that they want to explore an alternative development process. Once they make that decision, they do a request for proposals for the not-for-profit entity, in our case NDC, that would help them to make that possible. And that's, as you saw on Mike's timeline, that was the first step for Redmond. They did the RFP for a nonprofit to be their partner. And then you develop a request for qualifications for team members, making sure that they have experiences on similar projects and references. So next slide will show what does that mean. Generally, we have found that when the RFP goes out to a development team, communities are best served if it's issued to only 3 or 4 teams, because there's not a lot of people who do this work. And so you don't really want the community to have to go through a million things that are not relevant, but instead do some work to find folks who really know what they're doing. And then there are 5 critical questions. Who are the team members? What kind of time are those team members able to commit to this project? And what's your experience on what's their experience on similar projects? What ideas does the team bring to create public value? And will the team accept the terms of the pre-supplied pre-development agreement and the development agreement? Then once you develop an assumed per square foot hard cost, you can bid the soft cost. And finally, clarity that there will be confidentiality, because in fact, the teams have to present financial information and litigation history. And that's something that a local community has to work carefully with, because if you don't structure the RFP properly, you're going to have a difficult time getting people to be willing to respond to it, because they're not ready to have their finances and their litigation history revealed to the whole world, just to the people who have to be involved. We've also found that architectural renderings can be challenging, because if you have teams that everybody puts together a picture, the community gets fixed on that picture. And all of the pictures that are initial architectural renderings don't have enough information to know whether that's what it's really going to ultimately look like. You remember in the Redmond, there were some architectural renderings, and Mike said, well, here's a couple pictures, but here's the actual picture of what came out. That it's a better process to really look at the quality of the team rather than the quality of the picture. And the picture can sometimes take you away from the discussion with the team, which is described again on the next slide. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. Best practice. Here's what do you have to do? So now you're ready to do it. The community or the sponsoring entity has to interview the team. And our advice is that you interview the teams separately. You don't try to interview everybody all together. And interview other public agencies that have used the team. So, you know, if you're a city considering having this conversation, you want to go talk to Mike and his team and say, okay, what was it like? Why did you do it? How did they work? And whoever you're reviewing, you want to go to other public agencies. If you have the capacity to go visit the project, it sometimes helps to actually see a project that was done. NDC has done 41 of these public-private partnerships, and every single one has come in on time, at or under budget, and they're in various parts of the country. As I said, you do separate interviews for each team member, and then examine the financial information and the litigation records. So this is trying to collapse into 1 hour, an exciting but a little bit complicated process, an opportunity to combine the lowest cost of capital using tax-exempt debt with the efficiency and effectiveness of the private sector, is an opportunity to really help government get what they want, get it timely, and get it within a reasonable budget. So we're happy to take questions. We have a few minutes for questions. And I know that both Mike and I will give you our contact information and be happy to respond to additional requests as we move forward. So Lourdes, are you taking over the questions and guiding us through that?
Yes, thank you, Jane and Mike, for that wonderful presentation. We do have a robust list of questions building, and I want to assure the audience of a couple of housekeeping matters. We're going to show you in a minute or two a few resources where you can actually learn more about other models, and also we'll be providing the slide deck and the recorded webinar as resources on our website, so you will be able to access that for those of you who have asked. And we're going to ask Jane, of the many questions that came in, one question, and then provide her and Mike with the questions that have been submitted so that they know who to follow up with for those of you who have submitted questions and comments. Now, Jane and Mike, I know there's a long list of P3s that have turned out to be very bad for governments, cases in which public leaders failed to ask the right questions, understand whether they were getting a good deal. What kinds of questions should a community be asking at different stages of planning, implementing, and then after the implementation of a P3, including things about, you know, the cost of capital, the transaction costs at different stages, the profile of investors you want to attract, how the city's going to be involved. Walk us through a little bit of that, and as you answer, I'm going to show the audience a little bit of the portfolio of projects that have fallen under this model and that they can learn about through some of the resources we'll discuss at the end through the NDC website.
Okay, well, I can start, and I really invite you, Mike, to join in on the questions.
Sure.
In order to do a P3 project, the community has to first determine what are you really trying to build, and what do you want, and what role does the community want to have in the operation. For example, there was a terrible story about the way in which the Chicago parking activities moved forward, because one of the things that they didn't consider in the agreement was the fact that the way the agreement was structured, if the city closed down streets for festivals, which is a big deal in Chicago, that the city would then be liable to the parking operator for lost revenue. Now, that's the kind of real analytical details that the community needs to know about. How do these projects, what are going to be the financial implications of these projects for your community? What are you anticipating? And so you want to make sure that the contract is balanced and clear for both sides.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of thoughts. As I said earlier, I think that it ends up being a form of a partnership between all the players, and the legal documents need to accurately reflect the intentions of all the partners. So there's a significant amount of balancing that needs to go into the various tensions that will exist in any kind of a project of this nature between the different interests of the different partners. And I think that can be given a short shrift if you're not careful, as Jane is alluded to. The other thing I would say is that the public entity, the sponsoring entity, may see this as a way of adding capacity to their ability to manage projects. And again, I would caution that the sponsoring agency has a different role now rather than a traditional, design, bid, build role, but needs to ensure they've got the right kind and adequate resource to proactively participate in these conversations and support them so that they can, one, remain on time, and two, that any differences that come up from what was perceived to occur and what seemed to be occurring now can be resolved in a very timely and proactive sort of manner. So those would be a couple of thoughts that would occur to me.
Great.
I think the other thing is, one of the reasons that NDC is unique in this world is that NDC is a nonprofit entity. We exist in order to lessen the burdens of government. So we, as the intermediary to create the special purpose not-for-profit entity, bring the resources and the technical assistance to the community about how to do these negotiations. Building a city hall, building a public structure is a once-in-a-generation activity for a community and for the staff of a community, whereas for developers, that's what they do day in and day out. And so you need to make sure that you don't get unmatched in terms of expertise.
Great, all important considerations. And for our listeners, I want to point them to the National Development Council website as one of the first resources that we want to highlight, because there is a treasure trove of information that Jane and her colleagues at NDC include about the multiple case studies that really illustrate a lot of the principles that we've talked about today, and that we encourage everybody to take a look at. Jane and Mike, is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I know we're running very close to the end of our webinar. Any final thoughts for the audience before we talk about some additional resources they can consult on this topic?
I want to thank the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy for putting this together and bringing Mike and I to your resource, to your community.
Oh, great. Well, Jane, Mike, first of all, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. We're thrilled that on such an important topic such as public-private partnerships, we're able to bring your expertise to our audience. And we encourage everybody to take a look, not just at sort of the success of the City of Redmond, but other cities across the United States with this model, and to consider kind of the implications for the adoption of some of these principles internationally as well. To that end, we do know that this is quite a topic that has so many layers and dimensions, and we wanted to leave you, as we do on every webinar, with a few resources that you can also look to from the Lincoln Institute in terms of our publications and other assets. Our magazine Landlines often includes a number of articles, not just highlighting topics that could be relevant to the issues we've discussed today, but others in land policy and infrastructure finance, and point you also to several of our books that at least cover the topic of P3s within the umbrella of broader themes of financing metropolitan governments in developing countries, infrastructure and land policies, and also international lessons for U.S. policymakers in areas that include, for example, high-speed rail and others that could be of interest to our listeners today. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us, encourage you to look out for an email from us providing you with all of the resources that we've shared today, and have you join me in thanking our presenters, Mike and Jane, for the wonderful job they did introducing us to this model. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.